The day began like any other for 14-year-old Nia Johnson. She was a bright and ambitious teenager, known for her quick wit and her passion for art. Her asthma, however, was an ever-present challenge, one that often made her feel different from her peers. That morning, she kissed her dad goodbye as he headed out in his police uniform for another long day at the precinct. Nia grabbed her inhaler, tucked it into her bag, and walked to the bus stop with a sense of routine. At the corner store near her school, Nia decided to pick up a bottle of water. The shop was bustling with early morning customers grabbing coffee and breakfast. She weaved her way to the counter, her inhaler sticking out slightly from her pocket. As she paid for her drink, a towering man in a police uniform stepped behind her in line. It was Officer Mason, a name she didn't know but a presence she felt immediately. His commanding voice barked at the cashier to hurry up, drawing the attention of everyone in the store. Nia felt uneasy as Mason's gaze settled on her. "What's that you've got there, kid?" he asked, pointing at the inhaler peeking out of her pocket. His tone was accusatory, as if she were hiding something illicit. She hesitated but replied politely, "It's my inhaler. I have asthma." Mason smirked. "Asthma, huh? You kids always have some excuse. Let me see that." Before she could react, he reached over and snatched the inhaler from her hand. The room went silent. Nia was stunned, her voice caught in her throat. She managed to stammer, "Please, I really need that. I can't breathe without it." Mason laughed, a cold and dismissive sound that made her cheeks burn with humiliation. "You'll be fine, kid. Maybe this will teach you not to bring suspicious stuff around." He waved the inhaler in the air, a mocking gesture that drew muffled gasps from the onlookers. Nia's chest began to tighten, her breaths shallow and strained. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I need it now." A middle-aged woman near the coffee station stepped forward, her face a mixture of concern and anger. "Officer, the girl is clearly struggling. Give her the inhaler," she demanded. Mason turned to her, his smirk fading into a glare. "Mind your business, lady." "I know what I'm doing," he snapped, his tone dripping with authority. The woman didn't back down. "She's just a kid." "You can't," Mason cut her off, raising his hand as if to silence her. "If you've got a problem, file a complaint. But I'm not taking orders from you." The exchange grew heated, but Nia could barely process it. Her chest felt like it was caving in. She stumbled backward, clutching at her throat, her vision blurring. The scene took a dramatic turn when a young man in his 20s, who had been filming the incident on his phone, stepped in. "You're gonna go viral for this," he said, his voice steady but charged with anger. Mason turned sharply, his expression darkening. "Put that phone down, or I'll arrest you for obstruction," he barked. The man didn't flinch. "Go ahead. Let the world see how you treat kids." By now, the store manager had come out from behind the counter, visibly distressed. "Officer, please," he pleaded, "she's not a threat. Just give her the inhaler." Mason's grip tightened around the small device as if it were a badge of his authority. But before he could respond, Nia collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. The room erupted in chaos. The middle-aged woman rushed to Nia's side, shouting for someone to call an ambulance. Mason hesitated for a split second before tossing the inhaler toward her. It landed on the floor a few feet away, rolling under a shelf. The woman scrambled to retrieve it, placing it in Nia's trembling hands. With a desperate inhale, Nia managed to steady her breathing, but tears streamed down her face, a mixture of fear, humiliation, and relief. As the paramedics arrived, Mason slipped out of the store, his bravado replaced by an uneasy tension. He didn't know that several witnesses had captured the entire incident on their phones, nor did he realize who Nia's father was. For him, it was just another encounter he thought he'd control. For Nia, it was a moment that would forever change the course of her life. The ambulance pulled away, and whispers filled the store as customers processed what they had just witnessed. The young man who had filmed the scene looked down at his phone, the video already uploading to social media. "They'll hear about this," he muttered, a promise as much as a declaration. What none of them knew was that this story was far from over. Captain David Thomas was having a relatively uneventful morning at the precinct. The usual stack of paperwork awaited him, along with the constant hum of chatter among officers preparing for their shifts. As the head of the department, he had earned respect from his peers for his unwavering commitment to fairness and accountability. But today, something gnawed at the edges of his focus, a father's instinct that something wasn't right. It wasn't long before his phone buzzed on his desk. Picking it up, he saw Nia's school number flashing on the screen. A knot tightened in his stomach. "Captain Thomas," he answered, his tone steady but curious. The voice on the other end was her school nurse, explaining that Nia had suffered an asthma attack and was in the care of paramedics. Though the nurse assured him she was stable, the words cut through him like a knife. David was out the door in minutes, barely giving his officers an explanation as he grabbed his keys and drove to the hospital. On the way, his mind raced. Nia had never been reckless with her inhaler, she always carried it, knowing how critical it was for her health. What had happened? By the time he arrived at the emergency room, his usual composed demeanor was replaced by visible concern. He found Nia sitting on a hospital bed, her face pale but her breathing steady. Her eyes lit up when she saw him, but there was a heaviness behind them he hadn't seen before. "Dad," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with relief. He wrapped her in a careful embrace, mindful of her fragile state. "What happened, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Nia hesitated, glancing at the nurse standing nearby. The nurse gave a small nod of encouragement, and Nia began to recount the incident in the store. Her voice wavered as she described the officer mocking her, taking her inhaler, and ignoring her pleas. David's jaw tightened with each word. When she mentioned collapsing on the floor while bystanders intervened, his fists clenched. "Who was this officer?" he asked, his voice low but seething with controlled anger. Nia shook her head. "I don't know his name, but he was tall, white, and had a badge that said Mason." The name hit David like a thunderclap. Officer Mason had a reputation, a history of arrogance and disciplinary warnings that had been swept under the rug too many times. David thanked the nurse and promised Nia they'd talk more once she was fully recovered. For now, she needed rest, but he had no intention of letting this slide. As he left the room, his mind was already formulating a plan. He knew Mason, and he knew the systems that often protected officers like him. But this time, Mason had picked the wrong person to target. Back at the precinct, David didn't go to his office. Instead, he headed straight to internal affairs. The department's investigator, Detective Ramirez, looked up in surprise as David entered. "Captain, what brings you here?" Ramirez asked. David handed him a flash drive containing a video he'd just downloaded from social media. It was the footage taken by the bystander at the store, now circulating widely online. "Watch this," David said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Ramirez plugged in the drive and played the video. The room was filled with the sound of Mason's mocking tone, the gasps of the crowd, and Nia's desperate pleas for her inhaler. Ramirez's face darkened as the video ended. "This is bad," he said simply. "It's worse than bad," David replied. "That's my daughter." Ramirez's eyes widened. "Your daughter?" "Captain, David held up a hand. "I'm not here for apologies. I'm here to ensure that Mason faces the consequences of his actions. No cover-ups, no excuses." Ramirez nodded solemnly. "Understood. I'll start the process immediately." David knew the process would take time, but he couldn't wait for bureaucracy to play out. He needed to confront Mason directly. Later that day, Mason walked into the precinct, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He was laughing with a fellow officer when David approached, his presence commanding the room. "Mason," David called, his voice cold and sharp. Mason turned, his smirk fading as he noticed the intensity in David's eyes. "Captain," he said, trying to maintain his usual bravado. "My office." "Now," David said, turning on his heel. The room fell silent as Mason followed, his unease palpable. Once inside, David closed the door and stood behind his desk, his arms crossed. "Do you want to explain to me why I had to watch a video of you harassing a child today?" he began, his tone icy. Mason's face twisted into confusion. "What are you talking about? I didn't harass anyone." David slammed his palm on the desk, making Mason flinch. "Don't lie to me. That child was my daughter. And you stole her inhaler while she was having an asthma attack." For the first time, Mason's confidence wavered. "I didn't know she was your kid," he stammered. "It was a misunderstanding," David cut him off. "No, Mason, it was a gross abuse of power. And now it's public. You've humiliated this department and endangered a young girl's life." Mason tried to defend himself, but every excuse he gave only fueled David's anger. Finally, David spoke the words Mason had been dreading. "Effective immediately, you're on administrative leave pending an investigation. Turn in your badge and gun." Mason's face turned red with a mixture of rage and humiliation. "You can't do this," he spat. David leaned in, his voice low but lethal. "Watch me." As Mason stormed out, David sat down, his hands trembling slightly. This was only the beginning. He knew that Mason's actions were symptomatic of deeper issues within the department, and if he was going to protect his daughter and his community, he would have to face them head-on. What he didn't yet realize was that the video had sparked a firestorm far beyond their small town, and the consequences would be felt by everyone involved. The video of Officer Mason's actions spread like wildfire, igniting outrage across the community. By the time David returned home that evening, his phone had been inundated with messages and calls, some from concerned colleagues, others from activists demanding action. The footage had struck a nerve, exposing not just Mason's misconduct but also the broader issues of systemic abuse of power and racial bias within the department. For David, it was no longer just about protecting Nia, it was about addressing a problem that had been festering for years. Nia was resting on the couch when David walked through the door. Her mother, Elaine, sat beside her, holding her hand tightly. Elaine's face was a mix of worry and anger. "She's been asking questions, David," Elaine said as he approached. "About Mason, about why things like this happen." David sat down beside them, taking Nia's other hand in his. "I'm sorry this happened to you, baby," he said softly. "It shouldn't have, and it's not your fault. But I promise, I'm going to make this right." Nia looked up at him, her eyes still filled with lingering fear. "What if he doesn't get in trouble? What if nothing changes?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David felt a pang in his chest. He had spent his career trying to be a force for good within the system, believing that change was possible from the inside. But now, faced with his daughter's doubt, he realized that the stakes were higher than ever. "He will," David said firmly. "Because I won't stop until he does." The next morning, David arrived at the precinct to find a small group of protesters gathered outside. They held signs demanding justice for Nia and accountability for Mason. Among them were familiar faces, community leaders, parents, and even a few retired officers who had grown disillusioned with the department's culture. As David walked past them, one of the leaders, an older man named Reverend Daniels, called out to him. "Captain Thomas." Daniels said, his voice carrying both respect and urgency. David stopped and turned, meeting the Reverend's steady gaze. "We're counting on you to handle this the right way," Daniels continued. "Don't let them sweep it under the rug. David nodded, appreciating the Reverend's faith in him. "I won't," he promised. But as he stepped inside, he knew that keeping that promise would be far from easy. Already, tensions were brewing within the department. Some officers viewed Mason's suspension as justified, while others grumbled about what they saw as a betrayal of one of their own. The divide was stark, and David could feel it growing with every passing hour. In the days that followed, the investigation into Mason's actions began in earnest. Ramirez worked tirelessly, interviewing witnesses, reviewing body cam footage, and piecing together Mason's history. What emerged was a troubling pattern of behavior, multiple complaints from citizens about excessive force and disrespect, all of which had been dismissed or quietly buried. Meanwhile, the community continued to rally around Nia. Friends and neighbors stopped by the house to offer their support, leaving meals and handwritten notes of encouragement. Nia, still recovering from the trauma of the incident, found herself at the center of a movement she hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. One evening, as she sat with her sketchpad in her lap, she began to draw a picture of herself standing tall, her inhaler held high like a symbol of defiance. It was her way of reclaiming her voice. David, however, faced mounting pressure from all sides. The department's higher-ups were concerned about the public backlash and the potential for lawsuits. Some urged him to keep a low profile, to let the investigation run its course without drawing more attention. But David knew that silence was not an option. He called a press conference, standing in front of the cameras as a father and a captain. "My daughter was failed by someone who took an oath to protect and serve," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "As her father, I'm heartbroken. As a captain, I'm angry. But as a community, we have an opportunity to demand better, not just in this case, but in the culture that allows these actions to happen." The press conference garnered widespread attention, sparking debates on social media and in local newsrooms. Support for David's stance poured in from across the country, but so did criticism from those who saw his actions as an attack on law enforcement. The divide mirrored the tensions within the precinct, where whispers of dissent grew louder. Mason, meanwhile, was far from silent. He hired a lawyer and appeared on a local news program, painting himself as a victim of cancel culture and claiming that the situation had been blown out of proportion. Watching the interview from home, Nia felt a fresh wave of anger. "How can he lie like that?" she asked, turning to her mother. "People are going to believe him." Elaine placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Not everyone," she said gently. "The truth has a way of coming out." The truth, as it turned out, was even more damning than anyone had anticipated. Ramirez uncovered evidence that Mason had been involved in a cover-up years earlier, falsifying a report to protect another officer accused of misconduct. The revelation added fuel to the fire, leading to demands for a complete overhaul of the department's disciplinary procedures. As the protests grew larger, David found himself at the forefront of a movement he hadn't planned to lead. Community meetings became a regular occurrence, with residents sharing their stories and brainstorming solutions. Nia, despite her initial reluctance, began attending these meetings, her artwork becoming a symbol of the fight for justice. One of her drawings, a powerful image of a police badge broken in half with the words, "Justice for All," written across it, was turned into a poster carried by hundreds of demonstrators. Through it all, David remained resolute, even as the challenges seemed insurmountable. He knew that the fight for accountability was about more than just Mason, it was about ensuring that no other child would have to endure what Nia had. But what he didn't know was that an even bigger revelation was on the horizon, one that would shake the department to its core and force everyone to confront the truth. As the investigation into Officer Mason's misconduct intensified, the revelations about his past actions and the systemic failures of the department became impossible to ignore. For Captain David Thomas, each day brought new challenges. The department was in chaos, with officers divided between those who supported reform and those who felt betrayed by the scrutiny. The community, emboldened by Nia's story, demanded change louder than ever. What had started as a fight for one girl's justice was evolving into a reckoning for the entire city. David barely had a moment to breathe as he juggled his responsibilities as both a father and a captain. At home, Nia's strength and resilience were growing, but so were her questions. "Dad, why do people like Mason even get to be cops in the first place?" she asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. David hesitated, knowing the weight of his answer. "It's a broken system, sweetheart," he admitted. "There are people who see the badge as a shield for power instead of a symbol of responsibility. And sometimes, the system protects those people instead of holding them accountable. That's what we have to change." Nia nodded, her young face etched with determination. "Then let's change it," she said simply. Her words struck David like a bolt of lightning. He realized that this fight wasn't just about exposing Mason, it was about building something better for Nia and her generation. But change wouldn't come easily. Behind closed doors, David faced mounting opposition. The department's union representatives were vocally defending Mason, claiming he was being scapegoated for broader issues. Anonymous threats began arriving in David's office mailbox, scribbled notes warning him to stand down or face the consequences. The community, however, rallied around him. Local activists, church leaders, and even former officers who had grown disillusioned with the system came forward to offer their support. Reverend Daniels, a pillar of the community, organized a town hall meeting to address the growing unrest. The event drew hundreds of residents, filling the church pews to capacity. David took the stage that night, his uniform crisp but his face weary. The room fell silent as he stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "This isn't just about one officer's actions. It's about a culture that allowed those actions to happen, and about the trust that has been broken between this department and the people we serve." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. David continued, speaking from the heart about his own struggles as a black officer navigating a system that often failed the very people it was meant to protect. "As a father, I'm angry. As a captain, I'm ashamed. But as a member of this community, I'm hopeful, because I see the power of people coming together to demand something better." The applause that followed was thunderous, but David knew words alone wouldn't be enough. He needed action. He began working with city officials and community leaders to draft a series of reforms aimed at increasing transparency and accountability within the department. Among the proposals were stricter disciplinary measures for misconduct, mandatory bias training, and the creation of a civilian oversight board. As these efforts gained traction, another unexpected development threatened to upend everything. Ramirez, the internal affairs detective, called David into his office late one evening. The air was heavy as Ramirez slid a thick folder across the desk. "Captain, you need to see this," he said, his voice grim. David opened the folder to find a series of confidential memos and internal reports. At first glance, they appeared to be routine documentation, but as he read further, a pattern emerged. The documents revealed a deliberate effort by certain high-ranking officials to cover up not only Mason's past misconduct but also similar incidents involving other officers. The names listed in the reports included some of the most respected figures in the department, people David had trusted. "This goes deeper than we thought," Ramirez said. "Mason wasn't acting alone. He's part of a culture that's been protected for years, and these reports prove it." David's stomach churned. The implications were staggering. If this information went public, it would shake the department to its core and likely lead to the resignation of several key figures. But keeping it hidden wasn't an option. "We can't bury this," David said firmly. "The people deserve to know the truth." Ramirez nodded. "I figured you'd say that. But you need to be prepared for the fallout. This isn't just about Mason anymore, it's about the entire system." As the news broke, the city was plunged into turmoil. Headlines blared about the corruption within the police department, and public outrage reached a fever pitch. Protests swelled, and calls for resignations echoed through City Hall. For David, the backlash was both a vindication and a burden. While many hailed him as a hero for exposing the truth, others accused him of betraying his colleagues. Within the department, the tension was palpable. Some officers openly supported David's efforts, while others viewed him as a traitor. Mason, now suspended and facing formal charges, became a lightning rod for the growing divide. He continued to deny any wrongdoing, but the mounting evidence against him left little room for doubt. Amid the chaos, Nia found her voice. She began speaking at community events, sharing her story and advocating for change. Her bravery inspired others to come forward with their own experiences, adding fuel to the movement. David watched with pride as his daughter transformed from a victim into a leader, her resilience shining through every speech and every drawing. But as the fight for justice pressed on, David knew the hardest battles were yet to come. The department's corruption ran deep, and dismantling it would require not just courage but also unwavering determination. And while he had the support of the community and his family, the forces against him were formidable. What David didn't yet realize was that the next twist in this saga would test his resolve in ways he could never have imagined. The days following the public exposure of the department's corruption were a whirlwind of events, each more intense than the last. As Captain David Thomas braced himself for the fallout, he realized he was not only facing external pressure from the community and city officials but also internal resistance from within the police force. Whispers turned to open hostility in the precinct hallways, with some officers avoiding him entirely and others casting accusatory glances. David knew he was treading on dangerous ground, but his resolve was unshakable. He had promised Nia, and himself, that he would see this through. The situation escalated when city officials announced an emergency council meeting to address the growing crisis. The meeting was broadcast live, drawing viewers from across the city and beyond. Community members, activists, and reporters packed the chamber, their presence a testament to the gravity of the moment. David was among those called to testify, his reputation as both a father seeking justice for his daughter and a leader determined to reform the system preceding him. When David took the stand, the room fell silent. His uniform, usually a symbol of authority, now carried the weight of scrutiny. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I stand before you not only as a police captain but as a father. My daughter's experience was not an isolated incident, it was a symptom of a broken system. And if we are to restore trust, we must begin with accountability." David's testimony was powerful, outlining the systemic issues within the department and proposing actionable reforms. He called for mandatory body camera use, independent reviews of misconduct cases, and increased community involvement in policing policies. His words were met with applause from the audience, but not everyone in the room was supportive. As David stepped down, a council member with ties to the police union challenged him. "Captain Thomas, how can we expect to maintain order if officers feel unsupported and targeted? Aren't you risking morale by airing the department's dirty laundry?" David met the council member's gaze, unflinching. "Morale built on the backs of injustice is not morale worth preserving," he replied. "The only way to build true trust and respect is through transparency and accountability." Outside the council chambers, the tension was palpable. Protesters and counter-protesters lined the streets, their chants and banners reflecting the city's divide. Nia, standing alongside her mother and Reverend Daniels, watched as her father emerged to a flurry of questions from the press. Elaine squeezed her daughter's hand. "Your dad's doing what's right," she whispered. Nia nodded, her heart swelling with pride. But David's actions had made him a target. Anonymous threats escalated from words to actions, culminating in a chilling incident one night. As David prepared to leave the precinct, he found his car's tires slashed and a threatening note taped to the windshield, "This isn't over." Ramirez, who had been keeping a close eye on David's safety, urged him to consider protection. "This isn't just about Mason anymore," Ramirez warned. "You've rattled some powerful cages." Meanwhile, the investigation into the department's corruption uncovered a startling connection. One of the high-ranking officials implicated in the cover-ups was Deputy Chief Harris, a man David had once considered a mentor. The revelation shook him to his core. Harris had been a guiding figure in David's early career, often preaching about integrity and the importance of serving the community. To discover his complicity was both heartbreaking and infuriating. David confronted Harris in his office, closing the door behind him. "How could you?" David demanded, his voice a mix of anger and disbelief. "You were supposed to lead by example. You taught me to stand for what's right, and now I find out you've been part of this all along?" Harris didn't deny the accusations. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his face betraying a mixture of guilt and resignation. "You don't understand, David," he said quietly. "I did what I had to do to keep the department together. Sometimes that means making compromises." "Compromises?" David shot back. "You covered for officers who abused their power. You let the community down, and you let me down. This isn't leadership, it's cowardice." Harris sighed, the weight of his decisions evident in his expression. "You think you're doing the right thing, but this city won't thank you for it," he said. "The system fights back, David. And it's stronger than you think." David left the office more determined than ever. He realized that his fight wasn't just against individuals like Mason or even Harris, it was against an entrenched culture that prioritized self-preservation over justice. But he also knew he couldn't do it alone. He began assembling a coalition of allies, community leaders, reform-minded officers, and even former victims of police misconduct who were willing to share their stories. One of the most powerful moments came when Nia decided to speak publicly for the first time. At a community rally, she stepped onto the stage, her small frame seemingly dwarfed by the crowd but her voice clear and strong. "What happened to me was scary," she began, her eyes scanning the faces before her. "But I'm not scared anymore. Because I know we can make things better, not just for me, but for everyone." The crowd erupted in applause, and David felt tears prick his eyes. Nia's bravery was a reminder of why he had started this fight in the first place. But just as the tide seemed to be turning, another bombshell dropped. An anonymous whistleblower came forward with evidence of a secret fund used by corrupt officers to cover up misconduct settlements. The fund had been quietly maintained for years, with contributions funneled from discretionary budgets. The revelation sent shockwaves through the city, leading to immediate calls for an independent federal investigation. As federal agents descended on the department, the stakes grew higher. Officers who had once defended Mason began to distance themselves, fearing they too would be implicated. Mason, facing mounting charges, attempted to strike a deal, offering to name others involved in exchange for leniency. The walls were closing in, and the city braced itself for the fallout. Through it all, David remained steadfast. He knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he also knew that change was possible. The movement he had helped spark was bigger than him, bigger than Mason, and even bigger than the department itself. It was a fight for justice, for accountability, and for a future where children like Nia wouldn't have to grow up fearing those sworn to protect them. As the investigation deepened and the city began to reckon with its past, David found solace in the strength of his family and community. Together, they were proving that even in the face of corruption and adversity, the truth could prevail, and that real change was worth fighting for. The months that followed the federal investigation brought a wave of upheaval and transformation. The city, once divided and stagnant, was now alive with the energy of change. David Thomas, now both a symbol of reform and a target for critics, found himself at the center of a battle that was far from over. The federal investigation uncovered more than just systemic corruption, it revealed a deep, calculated network of manipulation within the department that had thrived for decades. Officers were implicated, resignations and terminations mounted, and public trials loomed on the horizon. The pressure on David grew exponentially. His home became a fortress of both protection and isolation. Federal agents were assigned to ensure his family's safety after another anonymous threat arrived, this time accompanied by a rock thrown through their front window. The message scrawled on the accompanying note read, "You're tearing us apart." Nia and Elaine remained brave, but the tension was palpable. Every creak of the floorboards or unfamiliar car passing by at night heightened their anxiety. David, however, refused to back down. "If we let fear dictate our actions, they win," he told Elaine one evening. She nodded, her eyes tired but filled with pride. "We stand together, David. Always." Despite the risks, David continued to push for change, leveraging the momentum created by the investigation. Town hall meetings became a regular occurrence, giving citizens a platform to share their stories and frustrations. Nia attended every meeting, often sitting in the front row with a notebook, jotting down ideas and observations. She had grown into an active participant in the movement, her courage inspiring many in the community. During one such meeting, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson stood to speak. Her voice trembled, but her words carried the weight of decades of pain. She recounted how her son had been falsely accused of theft by an officer years ago and had spent years in prison before being exonerated. "I stayed quiet for too long," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "But seeing what Captain Thomas and his family are doing, seeing Nia, I realize it's never too late to fight for what's right." Her story was met with thunderous applause and sparked a flood of similar testimonies. The community was no longer afraid to speak out, and their collective voices became an unstoppable force. David knew this was the turning point. Real change required not just systemic reforms but also a cultural shift, one where silence and fear were replaced with courage and accountability. Meanwhile, within the department, the cracks deepened. Deputy Chief Harris, once a revered figure, became a central figure in the federal investigation. Under mounting pressure, he eventually agreed to testify against other high-ranking officials, providing a detailed account of how the department's corruption had been orchestrated. His testimony was a bombshell, implicating several prominent figures and leading to widespread arrests. Harris's fall from grace was both a personal and professional blow to David, who couldn't reconcile the mentor he had once admired with the man now exposed as a key player in the department's darkest secrets. As the trials began, Mason faced the full weight of justice. The evidence against him was overwhelming: testimony from victims, video footage of his abusive behavior, and financial records linking him to the secret fund. His defense crumbled under the scrutiny, and the jury deliberated for less than a day before delivering a guilty verdict. Mason's sentencing marked a significant victory, but David knew it was just one step in a much larger journey. In the aftermath, the department underwent a complete overhaul. New leadership was appointed, many of whom were officers David had personally mentored. Policies were rewritten, training programs revamped, and community policing initiatives introduced. The Civilian Oversight Board David had advocated for was established, giving citizens a direct role in holding the department accountable. But the journey wasn't without its setbacks. Resistance from some officers remained strong, and the road to rebuilding trust with the community was long and arduous. David faced criticism from all sides. Some accused him of being too lenient, while others labeled him as overly radical. He bore the weight of these criticisms with quiet resolve, focusing on the larger goal. One evening, as David sat in his office, exhausted but reflective, Nia walked in carrying a large poster board. She placed it on his desk, revealing a vibrant drawing of a bridge connecting two cliffs. On one side were people of all backgrounds, and on the other, officers in uniform. Above the bridge, Nia had written in bold letters, "Together, we build." David stared at the drawing, his throat tightening with emotion. "It's beautiful, Nia," he said. "What inspired you?" She shrugged, a shy smile playing on her lips. "You did. You're building a bridge between people and the police. I just wanted to show what it could look like." In that moment, David realized the true impact of their journey. It wasn't just about policy changes or exposing corruption, it was about creating a foundation for future generations. Nia's drawing became the symbol of the movement, featured on banners, posters, and social media campaigns. It reminded everyone of what they were working toward: unity, trust, and justice. Years later, the city would look back on this period as a turning point. The reforms implemented under David's leadership became a model for other cities grappling with similar challenges. Nia grew up to become a community leader in her own right, continuing the work her father had started. And David, though retired from the force, remained a beloved figure, his name synonymous with integrity and courage. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching the sunset with Elaine and Nia, David felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been painful and fraught with challenges, but it had also been transformative. He had faced the system, exposed its flaws, and emerged stronger, not just as an officer but as a father, a leader, and a bridge builder. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by his family and the community he had fought so hard to protect, David knew that the fight for justice was worth every sacrifice.